Hello, and welcome to the in-week edition of I'm Still Playing. So, you couldn't swing a dead cat on the internet this week without hearing about the layoffs and restructuring going on over at Bioware, and how all of this came about amidst the news that Veilguard had only hit about 50% of its projected revenue. So then, of course, the internet just absolutely blew up with doomsayers and death callers talking about this is the death of Dragon Age, and maybe even of Bioware itself. And, a lot of that may be true. But as someone who's been in this business for a long time, when I hear news like this, I like to try to look at the news behind the news and see if we can't tell what's really going on. And yes, while Bioware is definitely riding on what seems to be a tsunami of mistakes lately, I also want to talk about how I think this might actually be good news for the studio. What can I say? I've always been a bit of a silver lining kind of guy. So if you've been around the channel for any amount of time, you've heard me say it before, but I think it bears repeating. The single biggest thing that will kill games or result in poor games is a lack of focus. And Bioware has been flailing to find its focus for almost a decade now. Mark Dara, over at his channel, he put up an excellent video about 2 weeks ago in which he describes what's been going on at Bioware for the past decade. Now, as you may or may not be aware, Mark Dara worked at Bioware for years and was at one time the executive producer on Dragon Age. So if there's anyone who knows about what's going on or can speak with authority about what's been happening there for the last decade, it's him. And the scene that he describes at Bioware is grim. In short, in 2017, they cannibalized the leadership and the team from Dragon Age to ship Andromeda. Then they cannibalized Dragon Age again for Anthem. And then after that, when Anthem shipped, for all intents and purposes, the Anthem team ceased to exist, and all of that team was then put back on Dragon Age. And so what you have is a decade of a game having resources put on it, then taken away from it, and then put back on it again. And with each shift and change, a new leadership, and with that new leadership, a change in the vision and focus and direction for the game. And then in 2022, Corinne Bush was put on as game director, and you can definitely see where she brought her own vision and direction for the game as well. When games founder from a lack of focus and vision, it's a phenomenon that I like to call driving around in the desert. Oftentimes, a lack of focus comes from the lead designer or design team struggling to find and settle on what the core elements of the game actually are. We, in fact, struggled with this at Robot during Orcs Must Die Unchained, a game that started off as a 5v5 PvP game and ended up being a 3-person co-op game. And sometimes it happens when the CEO of your small studio watched his nephew playing Apex Legends over the weekend and came in on Monday and decided your game needs sliding in it, forcing your team to completely rebuild its movement model, even though you're only 3 months from shipping. This happens more often than you might think. And then sometimes, as is the case here, when a studio is scrambling to recover from one disappointing title to the next, and it is en masse moving people and resources around from one project to another, it results in each project coming out the door as an unfocused, unfinished, middle-grade project. And that is exactly what happened with Andromeda, and then with Anthem, and then finally with Veilguard. Veilguard wasn't particularly bad, despite what you may have heard. It just wasn't particularly great, and it really needed to be great. But here's the interesting part, and why the news may not all be bad. Because what you're seeing at Bioware is it's ultimately becoming, again, a one-product studio. The reason that no DLC is coming out for Dragon Age is because they're not leaving anyone, not even a small team, working on it. The entire studio is going to focus on Mass Effect now. And here's the thing. What a lot of people outside the industry may not be aware of is that game teams can only support so many people at various states of the game's development. And despite the fact that Mass Effect was announced back in 2020, there has been very little development on it because EA keeps shifting resources off of one project and onto another to get them out the door. And so Mass Effect 5 is actually still fairly early in its development cycle, which means it doesn't have room for the 300 plus people rolling off of Veilguard. So if you can't put all of those people on Mass Effect 5, well, you've got to find something to do with them. And that's exactly what they're doing at Bioware Edmonton right now. Some people are being offered new positions within EA. Some are rolling over onto Mass Effect, and some, unfortunately, were quietly let go. And this is pretty much exactly confirmed by BioWare's general manager, Gary McKay's blog post. Given the stage of development, we don't require support from the full studio. We have incredible talent here at BioWare, and so we have worked diligently over the past few months to match many of our colleagues with other teams at EA that have had open roles that were a strong fit. He clearly doesn't mention the layoffs because it's not very good PR to do so, right? But the layoffs were confirmed over on social media by a number of those people who were actually laid off. And while the restructuring certainly isn't good news for those that were let go, I think it does give us a reason to actually hope for the future of Mass Effect. 1, Mass Effect is still early in its development cycle, despite being announced 5 years ago, which means there is plenty of time to develop the vision for the game. 2, they have right-sized the size of the development team to fit where it is in its development cycle. And then 3, the studio as a whole, for the first time, is now singularly focused on a single game, or at least the first time for a long time. And this brings me back to what I've been talking about from the very beginning. It's all about the focus. And that's going to do it for this week's edition of I'm Still Playing. While I know it's all doom and gloom for Bioware these days, I do see a reason to hope, at least for Mass Effect 5. What do you think? Is Bioware finally riding their course, or is it just the swan song of a sinking ship? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Until next time, wherever you're playing and whatever you're playing, play hard. Cheers.